Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
What Waits in the Shadows, Volume 5, Story Number 1. It was Labor Day weekend of 1998, and some friends and I were working on a very low-budget movie. I was 19 years old, and both friends accompanying me were younger. Making films was our hobby back then, and we always had a blast filming low or no-budget action flicks. This day's filming locale was fairly rural and far down on a trail that was beside an abandoned closed boat ramp. At one time, cars could be driven into the clearing and boats loaded into the water, but a guardrail had since been erected, making it no longer possible. So we parked along the road beside the guardrail and began the trek down the trail. The perfect filming spot included large boulders along the water that looked quite treacherous from the right filming angle. They really weren't, and were good for swimming and having fun. It was a good little hike down the trail to the spot, and it took a while to trek back to the spot. Just as we arrived and were about to set up the camera, a bulky old VHS camcorder, a voice called from behind us yelling a friendly "Hello!" We immediately assumed the voice belonged to the brother of one of the film crew members, suddenly able to join us at the last minute, and replied with an equally jovial greeting. However, the man who walked up was somebody none of us had ever seen before. He had on ratty clothes, a ball cap, and was very carelessly shaven. His first question was, "Do you all remember me?" Of course, none of us did. He then explained that 8 months ago he was part of a group that helped pull a girl from the water when she injured herself jumping from one of the boulders. He asked what we were doing, and I obliged him with the answering of filming a movie. His next question was, "Who has a driver's license?" I told him I had one. He then explained that he'd been driving around on a revoked license, and his uncle, a policeman, had just passed him doing the opposite direction and shook his finger at him. So now he could no longer drive any place and needed a ride to the Golden Gallon, a convenience store a few miles away on the major highway. It was from here he was going to call his wife to come pick him up. This was in the days before cell phones. Well, this guy wasn't getting a ride from me, but my then passive soul still wanted to help him. One of the film crew members lived nearby, and I offered to go to his house and call the man's wife from there. Well, this seemed to piss him off. He leered at me and said, "I know you, don't I?" I told him he did not. He continued, "Because if you are who I think you are, I better start learning how to swim." He then asked if I had been at the Cherokee Apache rally the previous month. Again, I told him no, and even shared how I lived in another city 3 hours away. This was true at the time. He then countered, "If you aren't who I think you are, then you don't have to defend yourself." He kept his angry leer the entire time. I offered one more time to call his wife, but he declined and told us he was going to find some friends of his. He then left back down the trail. Initially, I started to suggest how we should set up the shot, but both friends were weirded out, and rightfully so, and wanted to leave. My friend then pointed out that while we were unloading the camera equipment from the car, the creepy guy had driven past us twice. I was apprehensive the entire trek back to the car, and when we reached the trailhead, the guy was nowhere to be seen, and we never saw him again. Story number 2. I was teaching on the Round Valley Confederated Tribes Reservation in Covelo, California. This is in Mendocino County. The parents and I were chit-chatting after our conference, and he was telling me of all the changes in the Round Valley over the decades. He said the HUD housing, Indian housing units, were built on the grounds where the Army fort used to stand. The home he lived in was shotgun-style place with long hallways from the front door to the back door, with rooms along the sides of the hallway. He said when he was about 10 years old, he got off the school bus and walked into the house, and his chore was to feed the dogs right when he got home. His folks were at work, and his older siblings were still at the high school. At this time, the whole area was full of houses and yards and such, and very little tree coverage. He said he scooped up the bag of dog kibble and opened up the door, walked down the back steps, and he said that the entire backyard, that was once an empty field, had huge trees, and he smelled wood smoke. Being that it was late spring, no one he knew would be using their wood stoves. He glanced to the side as he looked for the dog food bowls and noticed the tall green lush grass, and across where his yard should have been, there were 3 army soldiers around a campfire with an iron tripod over the fire with a huge kettle dangling down. He was petrified. He could see intense detail in their clothing, their rough appearance with their shaggy, shoulder-length hair, their mustaches, the long arms laid against 2 large fallen trees. He said he could see their yellowish teeth and that one was chewing tobacco and spit it into the fire. He said he could smell their body odor as well. He said he heard them talking what he thought was English, but their accent made it hard to understand what they were actually speaking. He started to walk backward towards the steps, and one of the fellows looked up and said, "Lord Jesus, what is that apparition I see yonder there?" He then turned and ran into and out of his house and down the road to his grandpa's home. His grandpa said, "Son, you got the sight. How you use it will be up to you." So, this story is set in the old-growth forest of Round Valley in 1881 or maybe 1981. Next story. I'm a very rational, sane, clear-thinking individual who has never done drugs or been diagnosed or had any indications of any mental illness. I've served in the military during the OIF era as an officer and been around modern military flying and flown in all sorts of aircraft. What I saw around the mid-1980s as a youth has no explanation from this world. I was probably around 12 years old and having a sleepover at a friend's house in a rural area outside of town. There were 4 of us between the ages of probably 12 to 14. We stayed up late and snuck out for a hike in the woods probably after midnight. At an elevated clearing overlooking treetops as far as the eye could see, we saw what we originally thought was an airplane, perhaps 2 miles away, but it was stationary and remained stationary above the treetops for a long time. We then saw it eject a red lighted object which floated, as opposed to falling down directly, into the tree line. Again, this was probably 2 miles out, so we could not make out the details. We watched it for a period of time. If I had to guess, I'd say more than 15 minutes, perhaps as long as 30 minutes, I don't remember. Next, we saw it moving in our direction, slowly and deliberately, just above the treetops. We had nowhere to go, so we laid down on our backs in the tall grass. The oldest guy there told us to close our eyes, knowing about the reflection light causes on eyes, and not knowing anything about infrared or other technology. None of us closed our eyes. I remember what I saw clearly 30 years later. It was a large flying object, perhaps the size of the wingspan of a modern medium passenger jet, passed directly overhead, very low. It was 1, totally silent. 2, moving very slow and deliberate, seemed too slow for a jet. 3, translucent. I could see the stars through it and just barely make out the outline of this triangle, sort of like the Predator in that movie with a translucent look. And 4, it had 1 light on all 3 tips for a total of 3 white lights. It passed slowly overhead, quite low, and I could see the outline and the stars through the translucent triangular body, connected by the 3 white lights. My next memory is the 4 of us running through the woods back to the house. We all sat down, and the oldest boy's instructions before we talked about what we saw was we all drew what we believed we had seen. I remember our drawings all matched. It was terrifying. I've looked for many times for my drawing and have no idea what happened to it after that night. As sure as I am that I sit here today, I saw this object with my own 2 eyes. I'm positive that in the 1980s we did not have that technology, and I've never seen or learned of similar technology in use by our military after spending years in the military and in a combat zone, seeing the most advanced stuff we apparently have in war. That leaves just one explanation: extraterrestrial life that is significantly more advanced than us. I've often wondered what that object was, the one that got ejected. I've often wondered why we were visited. I've often wondered why have an invisible flying object but put lights on it. Perhaps it's a safety protocol to avoid collision but still hide its identity. Lots of questions and no real answers. But by a process of elimination, I'm satisfied that we just don't have the technology to make an invisible flying object like what I saw, especially not in the mid 1980s, when the personal computer didn't even really exist. Next story. We own a farmhouse in southern Missouri, very near the Arkansas line. The main cabin is 3 miles from the main road near a creek in the woods, very isolated. We bought the place in 2003, and shortly after the purchase, my mother, who lived about 25 miles away, became ill, and I moved down to take care of her. Most of the time I stayed with my mom and stepdad, but one afternoon I drove over to our place for some time alone. The main house we refer to as a cabin is actually an old farmhouse built in the late 1800s. I think it's called a four-square design. Four main rooms downstairs: living room, front bedroom, kitchen, and back bedroom. Upstairs, an unfinished attic, front and back porches. The back bedroom had been modernized by closing off half of it for a bathroom. The original owners, who I'll call Smith, raised 11 children here without indoor plumbing, using a spring in the holler behind the house for water and an outhouse. We call it the cabin because the previous owners covered the outside of the house with fox log siding. A few weeks before, I was walking around the cabin and noticed one of the doors to the back porch had a beveled rock as a step. It looked just like many of the local tombstones, but no writing on it. The last time I saw it, it was busy worrying over my mother and put out of my mind, thinking I'd give it more attention later. On that afternoon, I'd forgotten all about the stone as I unlocked the cabin door and went inside. As I walked into the living room, I got an intense feeling of not being alone and that someone or something was trying to tell me something. I stopped and looked around, seeing nothing, but the feeling was overwhelming. I said out loud, "If you're not evil, I will try to help you. Just don't scare me. Help me to understand what you're trying to tell me." I also invoked the name of the Lord because I know there is much we don't understand, and some of it is very bad. Again, I scanned the interior of our cabin. It was calm, quiet, sunlight filtering lazily through the open curtains. Nothing out of place, the only sound the steady drip of the kitchen faucet. At that moment, the beveled rock popped into my head, and I was certain it was a headstone. Over the next few weeks, I stayed at the cabin when not caring for my mom. I began to notice odd things happening, like a weird white mist that came out of nowhere in the kitchen. I ignored that until my husband came down and witnessed it and reassured me I wasn't imagining it. There were also lots of electrical abnormalities. One morning, I got up and was walking into the living room from the bedroom. As I walked, I said to my husband, "Here, let me turn on the lights." As I had said that, and before I could reach the switch, all the lights in the living room came on. Not that odd in a century-old home, but at the same time I saw a light blink on outside. It was the interior lights in my locked Explorer. My husband witnessed this. One day, I was there, and the previous owner stopped by. We were standing on the porch chatting, and I just blurted out, "Is that a tombstone by the back door?" He just seemed to shrink into himself. Sighing wearily, he sat down on the porch and said, "I know the Smith's 12th baby is buried somewhere in the backyard. I don't know if that stone is its tombstone. I just thought it was a cool stone to use as a step. When I rebuilt the porch, I used it." He assured me that was the original placement of the stone, and if it was the baby's tombstones, that was where the grave would be. The practice of burying babies near the cabin is not unusual in Ozark culture of years past. There are also many large flat river stones from the creek just below the house spread randomly on the grounds in the backyard. They are the kind the pioneers used to mark graves when they couldn't afford a dress stone, so there may be more Smiths slumbering beneath the sod in our yard. I'm convinced the stepstone is the baby's grave. I've also come to believe the spirit that was trying to speak to me is the baby's mother. She died years ago in a nursing home in Kansas City. I lost my first child at birth, and the idea of Mrs. Smith dying so far from home, worrying over who would get the old home place and what would become of her baby's grave, breaks my heart. We immediately stopped using that door. The small back porch has two doors, and I planted a patch of daffodils to decorate it every spring. We're also going to have a small stone with a family name and estimated date to mark after we are gone. When we had some work done on the cabin, we had that door removed so Mrs. Smith doesn't have to grieve over anyone walking on her baby's grave. That may sound odd, but I'm a sixth generation child of the hills, and growing up learned to respect graves early. At that time, each Memorial Day, neighbors and family gathered at the local cemetery and spent the day with potluck dinner, remembering everyone who had gone before. People who'd moved away would come home at that time, and old ties were renewed. We children would play amongst the stones, marveling over the short lives people used to live, but if we stepped on a grave, an adult would be quick to make sure we didn't do it again. Once we began honoring the grave, the electrical and other odd little disturbances, along with the feeling of someone trying to tell me something, went away. We still have the occasional white mist in the kitchen, unrelated to temperature or cooking, and my husband and I have both seen a white image of a man walking across the front porch in the early evening. He seems unaware of us and is no doubt doing something he did in life. There are many other weird stories about this place. As odd as it is, I stay there alone, and I'm never scared as long as I have my dogs and my gun. As so many have said, it's the living that are scary. Next story. I have a story that still to this day gives me the creeps just thinking about it. I was bow hunting with my dad on my uncle's place about 30 years ago. I was in a stand on the north end while Dad was back in the woods 400 to 500 yards away. It was a cold, rainy day with the highs barely above 35. I was in the stand for about an hour when I got that gloom and doom feeling. Not so much that watching me deal, just a real bad feeling. I kept watching the field wondering if Dad was okay. I started scanning the woods behind me just to help get rid of that feeling. That's when I saw him. Not Dad, but another man. He was about 50 yards away through some brush, but it was clearly a man standing there. No movement, just staring. My first thought was someone else snuck in here and was hunting, but we didn't see any trucks parked anywhere along the gravel road, and it was a good 5 miles to any house. He seemed to be staring right at me, which was a little unnerving. I waved at him, but got no response. I looked out into the field to see if maybe he was looking out there instead of at me. No deer or anything else out there. I looked back to the spot where the man was, and he was gone. I scanned around and saw him much closer, but behind me, standing in the open between two cedars. He was close enough he had to look up to see me, which he was. He looked to be about 60-ish with a short gray-black beard. He had a long-sleeve light blue shirt and faded pants. No coat, no gloves. He continued staring. I waved once more just to get a reaction, but nothing. At that point, my bad feeling went straight to a time to fight for my life mode. I picked my bow off the hook and slid my seat so he could see me, prepared to draw if needed. I heard a vehicle on the gravel road, but didn't look away. He didn't look away either. Just then he made 2 steps and was gone behind the cedars. I looked up the road and saw it was a neighbor feeding his cows a big bale. I continued to scan the woods and nothing. The fight feeling was gone and back to the gloom and doom. I thought about climbing down, but I knew he was around somewhere. Plus, I didn't want to have to explain to Dad that I was scared of a creepy old man and spooked the deer which were due to come out. I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be walking out after dark. I watched the woods and could care less if a buck came out. 30 minutes later, I saw movement out in the field and saw it was Dad. He was slowly walking back to the truck, stopping and looking behind him every so often, and he still had an arrow nocked, which was rare. He got about halfway back to the truck and he motioned towards me to head to the truck. I shimmied down the tree and made a beeline to the truck. I too watched behind me as I left. When I got to the truck, he was visibly shaken. He kept a bottle of whiskey under the seat and took a good swig. I asked him if he was okay, and he just gave me a look. I asked him if he had seen the man too. Dad looked up and nodded yes. I told him what had happened to me, and he just nodded. He didn't go into great detail, but the man had paid him a visit, but much closer. We never went back there to bow hunt again. My dad wouldn't even talk about it later. I went with some friends there about 5 years later to do some quail hunting. We walked the fence rows, but when we got near that old stand area, I had the same feeling again and suggested we go to another place. Who was that old man? A bum? A hobo? Homeless dude? Poacher? A ghost? I don't know either, but he wasn't and didn't act normal at all. He didn't blink and should have been shivering in the cold with just a shirt on. My dad grew up on that place hunting, fishing, camping, and trapping, and never once had anything like that been seen there before. Next story. In the 60s, when my parents had just gotten married, my dad farmed on land reputed to be heavily haunted. He had lots of trouble with his one farm worker, who would go to neighbors over the weekend and would then drink so hard he would only be sobering up by Tuesday. So needless to say, he almost never turned up for work on Mondays. One weekend, after he and my uncle had a few beers, they decided that something had to be done. Incidentally, my uncle had the ugliest devil mask in his car, so they decided to go wait for him behind a bush next to the path he must walk home. Needless to say, Jonas, being of the older generation of natives, was heavily superstitious. Sure, at about 3 o'clock, they heard some footsteps stumbling closer, and by the drunken singing, they knew it was old Jonas on his way home. My uncle, wearing the mask, suddenly jumped from behind the bush. Shining a torch on his face in a loud, raspy voice, he said, "Old Jonas, I'm the devil. I've come to fetch you." Jonas just gave one look back and started running, only his eyes, teeth, and the soles of his tackies visible in the moonless night, and shouted, "Jesus, and you think I will wait for you?" Jonas didn't return for work that Monday either. In fact, they never saw him again. Next story. This story is my dad's and happened in Vietnam in 1967. My dad was a Marine infantryman and had only been in the country for a few days when his fire team was assigned night ambush duty. They set up on a T where two trails came together with rice paddies on one side, single canopy jungle everywhere else. None of them had been in the country long, and this was their first night ambush, so they were all a bit jumpy. They set out their claymores and settled in. Visibility was pretty good as the moon was close to full. They'd been waiting for an hour or so when they noticed something pale and kind of shiny moving towards them through the rice paddies. It was about 18 inches above the rice and moving slowly in their direction. Dad said it looked just like a man's face shining in the moonlight. They were sure it was an NVA or a VC sapper crawling up on them in the dark. They blew all their claymores, then each guy threw a grenade and fired one magazine, then hauled ass back to the wire. The wire was only 300 yards or so away, and Pop said they made it real fast. After sunup, they patrolled to the ambush site to see what the enemy looked like up close. They found a very dead 11-foot-long VC cobra. It had been hunting in the paddies. Next story. My cousin and I planned a day hike to the river. We grew up best friends, but we rarely get to see each other now. He works on his PhD at Harvard and only makes it back to West Virginia maybe once a year. I'm in the aerospace industry and don't have much time off this time of the year. We had one day that our schedules matched, so we set off to the river. The river we hiked to is about 6 miles from our house. It starts on my property, then goes into a neighbor's property of whom we have permission to be on, then goes on to public land once it gets about halfway to the river. There is no trail or path for this hike. We have made the hike half a dozen times following a creek all the way to the river. We haven't taken the exact same route yet. We meander off here and there, but we're essentially traveling in the same area each time. It had been about 3 years since we had last taken this hike. We set out about an hour after sunrise in 20-degree weather to ensure that we would have enough time to explore and adventure and enjoy the day. We were about a mile or so to the river and getting to the area where the creek begins to expand and starts to get pretty large. It takes a large half look and extends into a waterfall that is pretty large. We always cut that part and continue straight so that we can get to the bottom of the waterfall quicker. This time we decided to follow the creek. We fought our way through some thick brush and came to an open where we could see a bit. We saw a large rock cliff that stretches on for a while, so we decided this would be a great place to explore. We made our way to one of the overhangs and stopped for lunch. We made a small fire with my flint striker and some char cloth and relaxed for a bit before we climbed around on the cliffs. Once we rested up, we found a nice crack at the rocks where we could work ourselves up the cliff and get a great view overlooking the valley that the creek runs through. This was about 50 yards away from the fire we made, which we left smoldering because we weren't leaving the area just yet in case we wanted to get it going again before we left. We were looking over this valley from atop of this overhang on the cliff when two guys come out of nowhere, making their way to the creek. We didn't make our presence known because we couldn't tell what they were up to. One guy was carrying some sort of copper item, but we couldn't figure out what it was. They each had revolvers strapped to their sides as well. Neither one of us had brought a gun, even though I had just got a new one not even a week ago. This made us extra cautious. They walked a bit further and stopped. Then we could see what they were up to. They stopped at an area that appeared to be a moonshine setup, which explains the copper item that one of the guys was carrying. I knew right then my cousin and I were in a potentially dangerous situation. I don't know any shiners personally, but I don't think that they take too kindly about being seen at their mill site. We were pretty exposed on the front of this cliff facing as well. There were no real options to escape except back the way we came. We were far too close to take that option with them right there. There was a 100% chance that we would be exposed if we tried. We decided that hunkering down and laying low would be our best option until we got an opportunity to escape. I was happy to be wearing an all camouflage wool jacket and pants, so I blended in pretty well with my surroundings. My cousin was in brown tinted wool pants and a brown jacket, so he blended pretty well also. For about an hour there was no action. We lay low and watched the guys in the area running their still. We were nervous and on edge, but we weren't scared out of our minds. We felt that we could wait it out until they left and slip out in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, one of them caught wind of the smoke from the fire we'd left earlier. They began to patrol the area, and after about 20 minutes, they found where the fire had been. At this point, they were close enough to where I could hear them talking. They seemed very angry and scared themselves. They were cussing a mile a minute as they conversed back and forth that someone had been watching them. I was scared out of my mind at this point. I couldn't get a read on them, if they were leaning more towards being very frightened or violent from the way they talked. They were under us, and to the right, back where the fire had been. One of them then wandered around the corner, back into my vision, and he had his pistol drawn, holding it down by his side. The only thing saving us was that we were above them, and that they didn't appear fit enough to climb up to where we were if they did spot us. I felt like I'd held my breath for 5 minutes as this process was going on. They finally retreated and quickly packed up their things and headed back the way they came. We waited it out about another hour before we even moved. We then quickly climbed down the rock facing and got back on the ground. I couldn't resist taking a quick peek at this site. Sure enough, a copper pot for moonshine. I didn't stay much longer, and we turned around and made our way out, heading in the opposite way the shiners did. We didn't make it home before nightfall, and were forced to travel by flashlight for the last 2 miles or so, which was a first for us as well. I learned many lessons in this trip. I will never get myself into an area with only one way out. I will probably not hike without a weapon again either. I'm not sure what would have happened if we would have shown ourselves. It could have been nothing, or it could have turned out very badly. I can't help but think we made the right decision and trusted our instincts to stay hidden for many hours. Next story. I was about 17 or so, living in upstate New York. It was deer season and I was hunting on a raised area between 2 swamps. This was a great spot, akin to a superhighway for the deer. Mind you, this spot is not close to roads, being about 2 miles in. The day was pretty cold and windy. Snow had fallen a few days before and was frozen solid. I was sitting on a low branch of a hardwood that made a perfect natural tree stand looking down between the swamps. My buddy was about 200 yards away over a rise at the end of one of the swamps in a climbing tree stand. Around 8 in the morning, I saw movement from the end of the deer run between the swamps. Picked up my binoculars to look, and while scanning the area I see movement again. The object was white, obscured by some pines, but I saw it moving. Then, out of the brush it came. I kid you not, it was a clown. Rainbow, frizzy hair, red nose, the whole works. He didn't have any cold weather clothes on that I could tell. He was just kind of wandering around that area looking at the ground. Then I noticed a pistol in his hand. Kind of creepy for sure. I had not walked in from that side, so there was no tracks leading my way from where he was. I leaned back on my perch, putting the tree between him and I, and took off my orange vest. No way did I want this weirdo seeing me. My vest was a blaze of orange mesh, kind of like a jersey, so I stuffed it in my cargo pocket. I peeked out again. The clown was sitting on the deer run where he came out from, facing me, and he's about 100 to 125 yards away. He just sat there for about an hour. I kept looking at him through my binoculars while staying as much behind my tree as possible. The guy/clown was walking back and forth with a pistol on his lap. Then he got up, fished through his pockets, and pulled out a set of those wind-up teeth. He wound them, tied them to an overhanging branch on the trail, and let them go. The teeth were chattering away. He turns towards where I am, gives a thumbs up in my direction, does a clown laugh, and does a clowny sideways run into the bushes. I'm sitting there thinking, what did I just see? I sat there until around noon. No other noise. Head was on a swivel. No movement seen. Dropped down from my perch and put my vest back on. I cut over the hill and crossed the swamp, which was frozen, and headed to my buddy's stand. I gotta tell him this, even if he thinks I'm making it up. I found the run he set up and followed it in. Around a stand of birch, I see him up in his stand and head right for him. As soon as he sees me, he starts waving his arms and gives me one of those hand slash under the neck signals. I freeze, put my binoculars, and looked at him. He's about 75 yards away. He does the neck slash thing again, then points behind him around the tree. Then I hear it, that damn clown laugh. A lot. He looked freaked out. I sat there near the birches for what felt like forever, with my rifle at the ready. The laughing had stopped a while ago. My buddy finally started climbing down the tree. Came down the trail to me and said that there was some dude dressed like a freaking clown fooling around near my scrape. Then I told him what had happened in my spot. We split and told his older brother. A few of the adults all wanted us to show them where this was the next morning. The next morning we headed out towards my spot. When we got there, there was now 3 chattering teeth hanging on the trail. We found tracks in the snow, clown shoe tracks. We followed the tracks. The tracks cut the long way around one swamp and straight to my buddy's spot. There were other chattering teeth hanging there too, along with one of those rubber chickens. At this point, they believed us and went out to find this guy. They never did. Tracks eventually led to a parking area near a pond a few miles over and disappeared. We were cautious in that area for a long, long time after that.